This is Join Us in France, episode 33. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
And we welcome you to the Join Us in France travel podcast. Elise is a professional tour guide, art historian, and a really good storyteller.
Oh, do we know that?
On today's show, we go visit a wonderful place in southeastern France.
Yes, southeastern.
It's our first time going to the southeast.
First time,
so,
indeed.
Provence.
And
more specifically, Aix-en-Provence. Beautiful city. I was there just a couple of years ago. I've been there many times in my life. I've been to Provence many times, both for work, for family, for all sorts of things. So it's going to be a very fun show. And we'll just get it started with a little music, and then we'll come back and talk about Provence.
Wait, then see.
So we are back, and today I want to thank listeners who write comments and questions
it's very good.
on joinusinfrance.com. So I'm going to tell you about a few of them because, for instance, recently I heard from Steve, who sent us a thank you email, and then David, who asked for French music recommendations, and he also gave good tips about how to get reduced fees at museums and such. Scott Perry talks about a wonderful trip he took to France. I'm going to read a little bit of his comment because he took the time to write a long comment, and it was very good. He says, I stumbled upon your podcast as I was researching Albi and Carcassonne. It was an excellent tutorial in preparation. I knew very little about Albi and Carcassonne, so it was a great teaser as we drove south through the Tarn region. Tarn. Oh, Tarn. He wrote Tarn, but he meant Tarn, yes.
Of course.
And into the Languedoc. Your description of Albi was fantastic, particularly the interior of the cathedral. Yes, it's a beautiful place. And then he talks about Carcassonne, and he says that was a little bit disappointing, but we had warned them in the show that it was very touristy.
Right.
And then he says, I certainly, this is a podcast I will look forward to listening to in the future as I look for inspiration for future visits. And then he asks if we could do something about a show about Catharism. The Cathars.
About the Cathars.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
We should.
It's a little bit esoteric, I would say. It's a kind of, I mean, it's for people who are have not been to France and who haven't been to the Southwest in our region where we are. I think it might be a little bit esoteric, but sure, why not? We can do a kind of special
and
on
it's a great suggestion. And we also heard from Lisa Young, whose comment made me laugh. She talks about being at the Adidas store on the Champs-Élysées and how she started the conversation. This is before she heard our podcast, okay? So she starts the conversation with the clerk with "Excusez-moi," or, she had practiced that. And the clerk rolls his eyes and like, another one of those, and and she doesn't let it stop her. She continues the conversation, asks for what she needs, and then at some point the clerk says, "Can I ask you a question? In your country, do you say hello before you ask for something?" And she was kind of taken aback because she says, "No, actually, in America," I'm assuming she's from America. Right. I don't know, but in America, you just get to the point. You say, excuse me, and you get to the point.
Excuse me is polite.
Exactly.
It's saying, excuse me. It's not just going over and saying, where is this?
Right. So she actually experienced this, and the clerk actually told her. And it's just a French quirky thing. So now she knows that she's supposed to say bonjour first, and then everything will be fine.
But, I know we've done this podcast, and you and I live this all the time. But I find it amazing still when I go into a store and I have to sometimes think to myself, don't just say, excuse me, because to me that's already being very polite. You see somebody who's busy, has their back turned to you. You'd say, excuse me, can you help me? If we were in the States, that's what you would do.
That would be great.
And here, if you don't start by saying, bonjour, before you even do that, they pretend they haven't heard you.
Yeah. No, it's a very quirky French thing, and I don't think it adds any value to our culture. But that's how we are,
But that's the way it is.
Yeah, that's the way it
is.
is.
Now all of a sudden it's we. Okay, Annie, I'll get you on that one later on.
Okay, and then Sharon, she suggested a great article in the New York Times about French wine, and she also made some very good suggestions about where you can find some of the more unusual French wines for sale in America. So anyway, you get the idea. Go to the website, read the comments, write some comments of yours, because there's some really valuable information.
Yeah, and I would like to particularly thank David, who's been sending us some very interesting comments in the last few months, and who's very, very, very assiduous listener.
Yep.
And so thank you very much, David.
Yeah, and the thing is, I do some stuff on Facebook, and I do invite people to go to our Facebook page. But Facebook is getting to be a bit of a sore point for me, because they really don't display my messages to very many of you.
And my messages going back sometimes get lost.
Yeah. If I'm going to suggest an article, for instance, well, I'm going to read the article. I might read some other articles that have to do with the same subject. It'll take me an hour, right? And then to see at the end that only 20 people saw it, I'm like, well,
But that's I think that's still good to put the articles on.
Yes, and if I see something that doesn't require a lot of research, I will put it up. But I'm not going to say, today is the anniversary of this important event. Let me find a good article on that, because I've thought of doing that. But then, when so few people end up seeing it, I'm like, I'll do something else with my time. And maybe I'm just being, Anyway, so please go on the website. It's a wonderful place to share your experiences and so forth. Okay, we're ready to talk about Aix-en-Provence.
We'll talk about where it is so that people can situate it if they've never been there. And I'll give a little bit of the history because, as you know, Annie, I love to do that.
Yeah.
And then talk about why it's a great place to go and visit and where you can go out from there if you use that as a base for a visit to that part of Provence. So let's begin at the beginning. First of all, the name. And this is one of those things that I, of course, love to do research about. I knew this, of course, already. And like you, I've been there many times. I was just there a month ago for 2 days, very short, very, very short 2 days. And it renewed my conviction that it is just an absolutely gorgeous small city and a beautiful area. Yeah. Although you need to know that if you go in July and August, it can be very, very, very hot. This is part of the Mediterranean region, which means that the climate is basically relatively dry. So in the summer, it can be very hot, but dry heat. And, of course, it gets cool in the winter. It can even freeze at night. But it's this lovely, lovely, lovely kind of climate. It's just something that I absolutely adore. Aix comes from the Latin. It's been changed quite a few times, but actually it comes from the word aqua, which means water. Oh. And just like a couple of other cities or towns in France that have the name Aix or Aix, A-X, it has to do with water because it was where there were thermal baths. And the thermal baths were basically created, as you can guess, by the Romans.
Of course.
And Aix-en-Provence, in fact, it has a very interesting ancient history. It is, just to situate it, it's 33 kilometers east and northeast of Marseille.
Right.
Marseille, of course, is a huge city on the coast, on the Mediterranean.
Third largest,
actually.
Yep. Yep.
But the metropolitan area, of course, of Marseille is about 1.5 million people. Aix-en-Provence right now is actually 140,000, which is a fairly good-sized city. It's growing very, very much. In the last 30 years, it's grown enormously. But the history of Aix takes us way back to literally the time of the Greeks colonizing the various places along the coast of the Mediterranean. And the Greeks created an exchange, what they call a comptoir, which means it was basically a colony for doing commercial exchange in this natural port of this area that they called Massilia. And of course, Massilia is Marseille.
Now.
So when you go, and we will do a podcast on Marseille very soon, when you go to Marseille, you can actually go and see what is left. There's very little left, but there are some small examples of the ancient Greek ruins of when it was actually a Greek cité, settlement. And the Greeks, over a period of several hundred years, made an agreement with Rome. If this is a time you can imagine, we're about 200 BC. And the Greeks are settled in Massilia, which is a very important economic port. And the Romans, of course, have picked up part of the coast of what is now Spain, and they're expanding their incredible empire all around the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
And both the Greeks and the Romans are on Sicily. And basically what happens is that the Greeks and the Romans make a deal. It's a very interesting deal. They make an economic military arrangement so that the Romans agree to protect the Greeks in Marseille in exchange for a cut of whatever it is they make. Sounds typical and logical. I mean, we haven't changed very much. This is what people do.
Yeah.
And Massilia was an extremely important port. And of course, what we have is the Roman Empire expanding all around it. The Romans are moving west into what, of course, becomes what they call Gaul, which is where we are now. Mm-hmm. And north of all of this area, you have these Celtic tribes, and they start coming down to maraud and attack Massilia. And there's a group of Celts who live in this area that's pretty much close to what is now Aix-en-Provence. So you imagine that this is 33 kilometers, is just about 20-something miles away from the walls of Marseille. And at some point in about 125 BC, the Greeks send, in whatever way they could, obviously we don't have the text messages and everything else that we have now, they send an SOS to the Roman army, which has its battalions pretty much stationed all along the coast of the Mediterranean. And they ask for help because they're being attacked consistently from the north by these groups. And so the Romans come in, and the leader of this group is a general named Sextius Gallius. And they basically not only chase these Celtic tribes out of the area, they wipe out the Celtic settlement, which was just a couple of kilometers north of what is now the center of Aix-en-Provence. Oh. And they decide that the best way of protecting Marseille, Massalia, is to create a small settlement city at this particular place, north and east of Marseille, as a way of heading off any other marauding groups.
I see.
So they create a settlement there, and they name it after this general, this consul, who has won this very important battle. And so they name it Aquius Sextius.
Uh-huh.
And this is, of course, in the ancient Latin. And it is founded as a small settlement with the baths, because they discover that there are these wonderful sources with hot water there, and the Romans, of course, just love
like that
baths everywhere.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there are these water sources is what gives it its name, and then it's in honor of this general.
Cool.
So this is the name that it keeps basically until the end of the Roman Empire. Mm. And of course, as everywhere in Western Europe, Eastern Europe too, but we're really concentrating on the area that we live in and know about. By the time you get into the 300s AD, mm-hmm. we have one group of what the Romans love to call the barbarians, simply meaning that they were not Roman, coming through one after the other. And you get all of them. I mean, we have a list. You know, if you ever want to know more about them, we can do one of these podcasts about them. But it's very interesting because it takes us into the idea of what migration was like at that time in Europe. But you have the Visigoths, you have the Ostrogoths, you have the Vandals, you have the Huns, and of course, eventually the Franks. Who come through a little bit later and chase out a lot of these other groups. They were, of course, the Franks were a Germanic tribe. Mm-hmm. And eventually you have basically the disappearance of the Roman Empire, and all of these groups take over and divvy up in various ways parts of what are Provence and the rest of South France. And the Franks settle the area. They've chased the Visigoths out. They have to deal with the Saracens, who come up from Andalusia. That's a little bit later. That's actually in the 6th century.
Yeah.
And then a little bit in the early 7th century. These different groups of Franks have basically created an administrative country. And, of course, we have the history of Charlemagne and his children and grandchildren. And they're trying to solidify and create basically what would be the beginning of what we would call a country, a city-state with rules and regulations. But they still have to deal with all of these groups invading. And so what happens to Aix, which is called basically Aqueous Sextius for quite a few centuries, interestingly enough, is that it loses its importance and it loses its walls. There's basically nothing left of the old Roman Aix-en-Provence. It loses its baths. It loses its theater. Unlike some of the things in the region around there, like the city of Orange, which still has its wonderful amphitheater and Colosseum. Aix was not that big and was more a military outpost mixing in with the local population.
I see.
And so it really lost its importance. And so what happens is that you go through a period of a number of centuries until you have the reconsolidation and the creation of the country of France, which is really basically at the time of the 800s under the grandsons of Charlemagne. And then Aix-en-Provence winds up becoming important again because they give the area the title of a comté. And we know that means that there's a count.
Yes.
And if there's a count, he's an aristocrat.
Either a count or cheese.
And is there a count? Oh, God. Oh, man.
Sorry.
All right. So, yeah. Well, I was going to talk about, I'm talking about food later on. I'm waiting for the next one. It's going to be as bad as that one. But basically what happens is that all of a sudden by the late 800s, Provence starts to pick up its importance again. And one of the reasons is that it's on the road going north-south, going up to Lyon, which is a very important city. You know, it's a center of silk trade and all kinds of other commerce on the Rhone River. And it's also a place that's not that far from Marseille, but is on the route that takes people east-west. So you go west going towards Arles, which is a very important city, and then eventually to Narbonne. And all of these are places we will be talking about in different podcasts.
Grab a map.
Grab a map, yeah. Well, we're going to have to show people on a map. But what happens then is that there's a slow renaissance in the commercial life of the city, and it eventually... they are now speaking a language that is what we now call Provençal, which of course is a derivative of Latin and is similar to Occitan, which is the language that was traditionally spoken in the rest of the south and the southwest of France. And
it's a delightful language.
It's a delightful language.
It's beautiful to listen to.
And in Provençal, they call it Aix-en-Provence. Isn't that very nice? And that is because the region has come to be called Aix. Yeah, they have. It's still the idea that it's the waters, and of course, it's to this day the waters of Provence. But believe it or not, this was one of those things. You know, when you do all of this research, it always like go, "Oh, I didn't know that." The actual name that we use today, Aix-en-Provence, is from 1932.
Wow, that's not very old.
It's not very old at all. It had its old Provençal name. And was used even into the 20th century. Wow. And then they basically changed it into they Francicized it, if you want, you know, and they made it into Aix-en-Provence. And that's what it is today.
Cool.
And there are still, in one small section of the city, there are still some baths. They're not Roman baths anymore, but they still have the sources of the thermal waters that you can go to. And of course, in the outlying area, there are 2 or 3 small towns, which we will talk about in another podcast, because like the Southwest, the Southeast is rich in places to visit and see and things to do. And there are 2 or 3 small, I would say large villages, but some people might consider them small towns nearby that still do have the baths. So Aix becomes very important politically in the late Middle Ages. And the Counts of Provence, who are very important because the region, and it's another reason to, in fact, take a good look at a map. We should be able to put one up.
I'll put one up on the site.
Provence is very big.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, it goes theoretically from Nice, which at the time was already in the 1400s and 1500s. Nice was actually part of Italy. It was part of the Genoan Empire. But it goes across from Nice all the way to Arles and a little further west. And it goes up fairly north into an area that no longer is part of the official Provence area. That is in the area that's called the Drôme. So it was quite big, and it was very rich. It was rich because of its coast, which it had its trading, and it was rich because it produced enormous amounts of textiles. It was famous for its textiles, and it's also a huge area for wine and fruit and lavender, something that I know we both love.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that area of the world.
There's nothing wrong with it. Yes, there is only one thing, and it's
crowded.
It's crowded.
That's why. See, that's a result, because it's such a nice part of the world that everybody wants to move there.
And it's very, very, very expensive.
And people are willing to pay fortunes for small houses.
Well, they pay a fortune because it of course, it is extremely beautiful. You know, we can do some people name dropping, but I don't want to. But lots of famous people. No.
Please.
No. Beg me. Yeah, lots of very famous people, American famous people we know have either chateaus or houses, and lots of French movie stars do also in the region. It is, of course, it deserves its fame, but it's overdone.
I think it might be difficult to find a Hollywood celebrity who's been a celebrity for any length of time. I mean, that does not own some sort of house or castle or something very, very nice in Provence.
Maybe, no, because I know a few who actually have chosen to be closer to where we are, probably for exactly that reason. That is that it's a little bit more open. There's a little bit less of the masses of tourism that you get in the summertime.
Oh, but just the density of population,
the density of
houses
population.
are really, really close together.
Right.
It's really hard to park.
We're talking
people who live
right,
there.
But I'm not even talking now about Aix. I'm talking about Provence. In general.
In general, this is all in general.
So let's go back to the story of Provence and about Aix. So we get to the 1400s. And France has annexed Provence through marriage alliances. There are different marriages made with the daughters of the counts of Provence. And we have a ruler who is... this is very interesting. At the time, in 1486, when France annexed Provence, it annexed it, and in the papers of the annexation, it is not subjugated to France. It is considered as an equal to France.
Ooh.
And the counts of Provence were that powerful that they could demand that in the annexation they would be considered as equals. So even though there is a certain notion of fidelity to the French king, they are not subjugated, which is very, very interesting as a nuance in terms of the history.
Yeah, it's an important nuance.
and there is a famous king, and of course, if you go to Aix-en-Provence, and we'll talk about it today in just a minute or two, but if you go to Aix-en-Provence, you will discover that there are streets named after him, hotels named after him, and restaurants also named after him, and that is a very famous king called King René, le Roi René, who was in fact not a king as such. He was the Count of Provence. He was also, by inheritance, the Count of Anjou. And Anjou is a region on the western side of what is now France, but it was part of what was originally the huge kingdom of Aquitaine, which was extremely rich and extremely important. And at that time, it didn't really matter if these two areas were not connected whatsoever. By inheritance, he was, in fact, the ruler of both. And he was also, believe it or not, king of Sicily, because it was the French kings
Why not?
who had gone to Sicily as well. It's a long, complicated history in terms of the genealogy, and it has a lot to do with all of these wonderful political marriages. But what happens is that this king, René, he had his capital in Arles, which is another very lovely city on the western edge of this region that we call Provence. And he marries a young woman whom he takes to Aix, because there is, of course, a palace in Aix, and this is in the 1400s and 1500s. You still have the kings and princes and counts traveling. They don't have one permanent home. They move around from one palace and one settlement to another. And they arrive in Aix, and they stay for a while, and she decides that this is where she wants to live. And to please her, There aren't too many kings that would do this, at least in the history, as far as I can see. In order to please her, and obviously it must be because it makes it politically expedient
Sure.
to move the capital, he moves the capital of Provence to Aix.
I see.
So starting in the 1480s and 90s, the capital of the entire huge region of Provence becomes Aix-en-Provence.
Aix-en-Provence.
And it is at this time, in the year 1501, that they established the university there. And to this day, it is an extremely prestigious university, specializing particularly in the humanities. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a section now because there's a lot of high-tech industry that has moved into the area. So they are developing, and they have a couple of separate technological universities that are also stationed now and established in Aix. Mm-hmm. But Aix is famous for being the place to go to study literature, the humanities, psychology, languages, and art.
Very good.
And so there is this prestigious university, and the prestige of Aix, of course, means that it grows. And so it becomes this very, very important epicenter for the region of Provence, and it becomes a place where a lot of things happen in terms of the negotiations and dealings, because we are still in a period of time when, even though most of what we now see as modern France exists, if you look at a map, in fact, it's really putting a bunch of Lego pieces together that can separate at any time, because you have the Dukes of Burgundy, you have the Counts of Aquitaine, you have the Counts of Toulouse, even though they've lost most of their political power. Each of these sections basically does a lot of negotiating with the central power in Paris in order to maintain a certain difference and in order to maintain its own economic independence, as well as paying taxes up to Paris, because of course all of this eventually is based on taxes. So Aix is a city that has a very hard time during the War of Religions. And just as a reminder to people, because I think eventually that would be also a very interesting podcast to do.
Yeah.
The War of Religions basically takes place during the 1500s. And it is, of course, a civil war that takes place in almost all of the country of France between those people who have moved over to the new Reformed religion, which is Protestantism. There's either Calvinism or Lutheranism, but in France it's mostly Calvin. And there is a huge power play because there are lots of ministers of the king's government and very important counts and seigneurs who actually are sympathizers of this new religion. And so there is a real fear of a loss of power. And so there is this very terrible purge that happens.
Yeah.
And Aix is a very, very Catholic city. It is a very, very Catholic city. There is a bishop there for a very long time. And so the small but very important Protestant community is basically chased out, and there's a lot of turmoil until the end of the 16th century when things calm down, and Aix is a city that is given the right to have a parliament. And one of the things that's always interesting, every time I read this, I have to remind myself to explain, because it's a little bit complicated in terms of understanding, that the parliament, until after the French Revolution, and unlike in England, was not a series of lords or even commoners who were voted in to decide democratic issues. They were people chosen by the king's representatives to enforce the king's law.
Oh.
It has nothing to do, nothing whatsoever, to do with our modern democratic notion of a parliament.
Yeah.
However, there were two cities in the south that had one. One was Toulouse, and the other was Aix. And that meant that they were the centers of power. Because if this is where you have the
enforcers.
King's, that's right, you have the enforcers, you have the king's representatives, who of course manage to always take a cut off of the top of anything anyway, and gather up a lot of land. And so everyone wants to come there. And one of the other things, of course, that makes Aix very important, and makes it very important in the region, is that being that it is the capital of Provence and very important, it has something that is one of the other things that I want to do a podcast about one day, because it is wonderful to talk about.
And you're not going to stop talking
the
then.
foire. No, I'm never going to stop talking. You know that. You know that. Even after I'm gone, I will never stop talking. The foire, which means the fairs. And a county fair in England and in the United States is a descendant in a very, very diluted form of what these were, because to have a fair, you had to get permission from the ruler of the region or of the town. And it was an incredibly important event because it was a huge economic event.
Yeah.
And people came from all over, not only the kingdom, from Spain, from northern Italy, from England, from far away, even as far as Byzance, Istanbul,
Wow.
selling their spices, their textiles, bringing things. And it must have been an absolutely wonderful event. And Aix was the center of a lot of these foires, which usually were 3 or 4 times a year. So we have Aix coming up through into the French Revolution. It goes back for a while to being a kind of sleepy town because Marseille is, of course, the big port, and Marseille is the place that receives a lot of people coming from other places. And it isn't really until the middle of the 19th century when there is a train system that connects Aix-en-Provence both to Marseille and then to Arles and then to other cities that it starts to pick up again. And just a couple of demographic statistics. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 20-something thousand people in Aix-en-Provence. That stayed almost the same through to the 1950s, after World War II. In the 1960s, with the opening of more university and various companies moving to the region, settling basically in between Aix and Marseille, what happens is that there's an influx of people, of population that's largely educated and technological and scientific. And then starting in the 1970s, it begins to grow so that in the 70s, it's doubled. By the 80s, that has added another 50%. And if you look at the statistics between 1980 and now, it is unbelievable, the growth of Aix-en-Provence. And of course, that's a big difference because it's now over 140,000 people. And what is amazing about Aix is that it has maintained its absolutely gorgeous, beautiful old city center.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is developed around it. But they have done, I have to say, as far as I'm concerned, a very, very good job of not making hideous modern buildings and apartments on the outside, because some other cities have not done such a good job of doing that.
I know a couple.
We know a couple. And it is really lovely because you have greenery, and even though it's very built up, and as you mentioned earlier, it makes for traffic jams, enormous traffic jams at certain parts of the day, it has maintained its aura of being this beautiful city in Provence. So
it does have a feel for maybe a village, you know. But I mean, the downtown. When you're downtown, you think, oh, it feels
this is
like
the
it's
old
small.
Right, exactly.
But then it is a big city.
It's a big city. It's a big city. I mean, it's certainly not humongous like Marseille. It has lots of students. 25% of the population is higher education, which means, of course, technological schools, university, all kinds of things like that. It has a lot of artists. It has a music conservatory. It has an art school. And so let's talk about Aix today and how to
what is
visit.
there to see? Yeah,
Okay.
what is there to see?
When you go to Aix, now there are 2 things. Number one, just as you can consider this just as a warning or just to let people understand. If you go to Aix in July and August, you have to deal with heat. Now, this is Provence heat, so this means it is dry, which makes it certainly a lot more livable. But having been there at the end of July this year, I think it is important to know that if you are going to go and just stay for a couple of days, it is important to look for a hotel with air conditioning.
Right.
It is now, Aix is a city that has 2 very important events in the summertime. It is, as you mentioned, beautiful when you walk in the old city center, which is basically in a circle.
Yeah.
And so there's a ring road really that goes around it. It is still old Provence. The houses are made of beautiful stone, mostly limestone, but there's actually a little bit of sandstone as well. And the streets are wonderful, little narrow streets, none of them straight. That's one of my things that I love, except for the major big artery that cuts through the city center, and that is called the Cour Mirabeau. Mirabeau. And that is named after a famous magistrate whose name was Mirabeau.
There's a poem sur le Cours Mirabeau something or other that I learned when I was a kid, and I can't remember it now. Let me look. Let me search for it.
Search for it while you can, while we're talking.
And I don't know if it's about that Cours Mirabeau or some other one.
Well, it is a very famous street, and of course it is associated with Aix-en-Provence. So what you have is this wonderful old city center that is all these old little streets with these gorgeous, very well kept up stone houses, some gorgeous mansions, lots and lots and lots of little squares that are in the middle of nowhere. You turn a corner and what you get is a wonderful tiny little opening that, of course, we call a square, but could be a triangle or a circle. There are shady trees on all of these streets in the city center because it does get so very hot. And what you have is an example of a very, very beautiful, medieval, prestigious city in its glory because of its heritage as a capital and because it has become, thanks to various writers, Giono among others, it has become a very important place to go besides its cultural activities. It is a place that tourists flock to all year long, and of course, particularly during the summer months.
Yeah.
And so the streets are wonderfully kept up. The whole city center, except for a few streets, is pedestrian walking, which is wonderful. You don't have to worry about cars bothering you a lot. On the big Cour Mirabeau, there's a whole series of wonderful café brasseries that are very famous. And there's one, in fact, that's extremely famous that's called Les Deux Garçons, which means, of course, the two guys.
And I have a picture of that I'll put on the website.
And one of the reasons it's very famous is because that is where two very famous people used to hang out when they were buddies. And I know. And that is
Cézanne
and
a writer. Forgot. Tell me.
Émile Zola.
Émile Zola, of course.
Émile Zola.
Yes.
And of course, one of the things about Cézanne is that he is one of the most important people that is now famous and associated with Aix-en-Provence. Cézanne, the great painter, Paul Cézanne, he was born in Aix-en-Provence, and most of his life lived there, even though he had he went back and forth to Paris quite a bit. And one of the things that you can do when you go to the center of Aix is follow the Cézanne Trail, and it's marked on the ground with beautiful bronze plaques. You can get a little brochure from the tourist office, and you can do the walk yourself. Otherwise, there are wonderful guided tours that tell you about the history of Cézanne and also the history of Zola. And one of the things about the story of these two people is that they were childhood friends. They went to the same elementary school in Aix-en-Provence.
Oh, did they?
They grew up and were friends, lifelong friends, until Zola wrote a book that was basically a disguised description of Paul Cézanne as an artist, and described him in the book as an artist who was basically a failure because of his difficult personality. And when Cézanne, they were already in their 40s when this book was written, but when Cézanne read the book,
he knew.
He stopped being friends with Zola and never spoke to him again for the rest of his life.
And what book is that? Do you know?
I had the book written down yesterday, and now I can't remember the name of it. But I'll give it back to you, and I'll put it in the notes that we'll put up on the podcast.
On the website, yeah.
But it's rather tragic as an end of a very important lifelong
that's
friendship. And one of the things you can do that I just did again in July is you can take a walk. If you, it's about a 10-15 minute walk up one of the hills that surrounds the city center of Aix, and you can visit Cézanne's studio.
Yes.
Now, this is not where he lived. It's absolutely beautiful little studio that has been left exactly the way it was. You have the paints, you have his little what would we call
Easels
it? I was going to say tablier, the kind of like painting aprons.
Yeah.
And you can see some of the work that he was working on. You can also see the things he used for his still lifes, the fruit, the bottles, the glass pieces. When I was there at the end of July, there was a young man there. 90% of the tourists who come to see it are English speaking. So he spoke very good English, even though he was French. And I asked him jokingly, because the bowl had real fruit in it. I said, obviously, it's not the same apples and pears that were there when Cézanne was painting. And he laughed and he said, no, but they do, in fact, change them every week. And they put new fruit in the bowl because, of course, one of the things that Cézanne was very famous for was his still lives of apples and pears. And he, like Picasso, is one of the precursors of one of the most important movements of the 20th century called Cubism. And he is considered to be one of the most important end of 19th and beginning of 20th century painters in France. Besides that,
hang on. I want to talk about that one. Because we went there too, and it's a beautiful... I mean, it's an old building, okay? They haven't done very much to renovate it. They just left it as it is. But it has these... It's a verrière, so that means it's got a lot
huge
of glass wall. And one of the things I remember discussing with the lady at the door, they must only hire friendly people in this little museum.
I guess they should only hire friendly people.
Well, but sometimes it's not the case. But the lady who helped us and explained to us told us that at the time the trees were much smaller.
Yes.
Because it's now surrounded by trees, and they don't really want to cut down the trees as severely as they need to for the view to appear.
But they are going to.
They're going to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Because for people who don't know Cézanne's work, one of the things that he did in a series, and actually he did more than 80 paintings, was Mont Saint-Victoire, which is this very big, very mineral mountain that he could see from the studio. And they are planning in the next year and a half to cut down the trees and replant the garden in the spirit of what they did in Giverny for Monet. They're going to redo the garden to make it look the way it did when he lived there. Which is very interesting because one of the other problems, you're absolutely right, Annie, one of the other problems is that there are now big apartment buildings across the street.
Yeah,
they weren't there before.
Yeah. But what they told us to do is to just walk up that street. Well, actually, I think we drove because it was a couple of kilometers away, where you could still see it very well. And they actually put up kind of replicas of his paintings, and you can totally see the Montagne Sainte-Victoire in the back.
Yeah.
And actually, I took a picture of my face right in front of the mountain. I'll put it on the website.
You did a selfie.
Funny. Yeah. It was somebody else. Somebody else took the photo, not
like
me.
Eiffel Tower on top of your head.
I don't think I have ever done a selfie in my life. Isn't that sad? Have you ever done a selfie?
Yeah, I did one this summer with my sister. I haven't seen it though. I have no idea what it looks like. I don't think I want to actually. But thanks. Hello, sister, because she was the one I went to Aix-en-Provence with this summer anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, of course, I happen to, because you know I love painting, and I happen to absolutely love Cézanne.
Yeah, Cézanne is wonderful.
So going there and going back, it was my very first trip to Provence a long time ago. I went to see the studio. So it was very interesting. Even though I've been back to Aix-en-Provence, I had not gone back to the studio in all these years. And there's something kind of reassuring in a way about seeing that the studio, of course, is exactly the same.
Yeah.
Because, of course, it's not considered to be, I asked them, it's very interesting. Technically, it's not a museum. It's a memorial.
Oh, I see.
Okay. So I don't know what that means in terms of the administration or funding, but it is, by the way, for those who are listening to us, you should know that it's all private funding that keeps the Cézanne studio going. Mm-hmm. So
it's not very expensive.
It's €6, which is not very much money.
Yeah.
So
I got to go back to something about the
Cours Mirabeau.
Yeah, it's not Cours Mirabeau, c'est le Pont Mirabeau.
That's not the same.
It's not the same at all. And it's sous le Pont Mirabeau coule la Seine. So we're not talking about the same place.
No, we're not talking
at
about the
all.
same place. No.
Apologies.
Well, that's okay.
But just for your reading pleasure, I'll put a copy of the poem that I had in mind on the website. Just for giggles.
The Cours Mirabeau is, in fact, the main straight artery that cuts through. It was created in the early 19th century, and it is the only street in the old city center of Aix that is not a medieval street. Everything else in the city center is, of course, very much an old medieval street. And as I mentioned, it's wonderful because it's almost all car-free. Not every street, but almost all the streets are car-free. There are beautiful shops. There are beautiful landmark buildings. There's a very lovely
I like
small...
the shops there. And you can actually park if you go in the shopping mall. Has a good underground parking terrace. And so it's...
What shopping mall?
There's like a small mall in Aix, in the center of Aix.
I didn't see it. Not in the old part. No.
Maybe I was
No,
a
I don't.
further
I think
away.
it's further out. I think it's actually further out. I don't think there is in the city center. What there is, and what is very famous in Aix, besides the culture, and I want to mention one more thing about the cultural things that are really draws to Aix. It is very famous for its lyrical music concert series every summer that lasts for 6 weeks. It's enormous. It's one of the most prestigious in all of France. One of the important composers that is used every summer is Mozart. There are concerts that are just music. There are concerts that are also with singers. If you want to have tickets, you have to buy the tickets well in advance. And also you need to know that during the weeks of the music series, those are weeks when you need to reserve your hotel room very far in advance, because it is one of, besides... It is not an opera series. Of course, the opera series are in other places like Orange, but it is an extremely important and famous musical series.
So what's the festival called?
It's called the Art Lyrique.
Art Lyrique.
Yes, Art Lyrique de Aix-en-Provence.
D'accord. Okay.
And it's very, very wonderful. There is a small, very lovely art museum called the Musée Granet, Granet, that I visited. It usually has temporary exhibits, but it's lovely. It's on this very small square with lovely trees shading the entranceway, and it's right next to this very beautiful old 14th century church. The markets are one of the other most important and famous things that you have in Aix, and there are two different kinds of markets. You have your basic food markets. And, of course, food in Provence is based on olive oil, garlic, and tomatoes, and everything that is considered to be associated with Mediterranean food. Lots of fish, lots of bay leaves and herbs of Provence and things like that. There is a huge market every Saturday that is not just food, but objects, soap and lavender and all kinds of things that are made in the Provence area. And I have gone to the Saturday market many times with a very good friend of mine who lives in Marseille. And it is a wonderful thing to do. You have to worry about parking. But if you get there not too late, you get to do 2 or 3 hours of market, which I'm totally capable of doing, and then going and having a wonderful lunch, either on the Cours Mirabeau or one of the small squares. One of the other things that's wonderful about the center of Aix is that it's filled with restaurants, and many of them are very nice, lovely little restaurants. The food is basically mostly Mediterranean cooking, but you will find a little bit of everything. And it is a lovely place to eat.
Don't go for cheeseburgers, okay?
No. I would, well, you know me, I would never go for a cheeseburger anyway. But besides the regular markets that happen all year, it's also famous in Aix. And this is surprising for some people, I'm sure, because they think of it more as a northern thing, but it's also famous for its Christmas markets.
Ah.
And one of the reasons why is because it is in the Aix that they make Santon.
Les Santons de Provence.
Les Santons de Provence.
Yeah.
And the Santons de Provence are these little figurines that are used for making the crèche.
Yes.
Now tell me, because I can't remember the name.
The nativity.
Nativity scenes. Thank you, Annie.
Yes.
I knew there was, yes. The crèche or the nativity scenes in the south, in Provence, are very, very different from the ones in the north of Europe.
Yeah.
And the Santon is a tradition that goes back several centuries. And they
It's
make
beautiful.
these beautiful, beautiful little figurines. And it's a wonderful, wonderful market. So even though the weather is not wintry at all, the sun is out in X 300 days a year.
Wow.
That's enough to make me want to go and live there tomorrow.
Yeah, nice place.
Just wonderful. 300 days a year. But you have this wonderful Christmas market for the Santon. And another thing, talking about just something that's associated with Aix, and it's something I happen to love. Brought some back the last time, but they are very expensive. And that is the wonderful sweet called calisson.
Yes.
The calisson d'Aix. And what is a calisson? What is calisson, Annie? What does calisson actually mean?
I do not know what the word itself means. To me, I associate it with just that diamond-shaped candy.
I wonder if the word actually has a shape meaning or
I can look it up.
like a boat or I don't know. But anyway, what's a calisson? Calisson are made in Aix. They are, I guess we would have to call them candies, although candy doesn't do them justice. It's made of...
It's marzipan.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's not. Guess what? I looked up the recipe online. It's not marzipan at all. It's crushed. It's not. It's crushed almonds.
So, and
orange,
what's marzipan?
No. Marzipan is almond paste. No, it's crushed almonds, orange and lemon rind from organic lemons and oranges, white of eggs, and sugar.
Yeah.
And it's got this wonderful, it doesn't have the same hardcore taste as something made with almond paste.
It's a variation on marzipan, but it's something that I have
agree.
I have a funny story about this because my lifelong distaste of marzipan comes from the calisson d'Aix. And I shall explain. This is 99% of people love those things. But when I was a little kid, maybe 9, 10, don't know, don't remember, a very nice neighbor of ours, my father had fixed some plugs. My father was an electrician, and he had fixed some plugs at our house that kept on giving her trouble. And to thank him, at Christmas time, she brought a big old box of calisson d'Aix as a gift. And when she came to deliver this box, I was alone at home.
No, I have a feeling I know what's coming.
And I ate every one of them, thinking that surely my parents would never know because this is not something they expected, right? So I was sick as a dog. And to this day, calisson d'Aix, it's just I can't. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you've experienced this. You made yourself sick on something and then you never want to see it again. Yes, it's something different. That's right. The calissons are very, very well loved.
They're very well loved.
Love them.
And one of the things about them, interestingly enough, is that they're still made in an artisanal way.
Yes.
That is, this is not a heavy-duty, really industrial kind of thing.
Right,
they're
right.
extremely expensive.
Yeah, they're pretty expensive.
They're very, very... And they are... What I like about them, besides the fact that they are made primarily with crushed almonds, not almond paste, and with lemon and orange rind, is that they're not very sweet. They're just sweet enough. They're not excessively sweet, but they are relatively rich. So I can perfectly well imagine that eating an entire box of them could just put you over the top. And one of the other things that is a product of not specifically Aix, but the region right around it that is wonderful is the rosé wine.
Yeah.
Now, rosé wine is one of the specialties of this region around Aix in the countryside. It's the rosé of Provence. I think we've mentioned before, rosés in France are totally different from rosés in the United States anyway. But my favorite rosé of all is the rosé of Provence. It is light, it is crisp, it is dry, and it is just absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And of course,
I'll find a couple of recommendations to put on the website
for
people who want to try some.
You mean to try a particular kind of rosé?
Yeah, rosé. Yeah.
You know,
Provençal,
we could,
real
but
Provençal.
this is a kind of an aside, but I think that one of the problems is that unless it's a very famous house or chateau, I don't think personally, and having discussed recently with an oenologue in Paris about things like this, I think if you have a bottle of AOC, Rosé of Provence, it doesn't necessarily make any difference whether it's one particular chateau or another. It depends on whether it's AOC, and it depends on the year, because
some years are better, of course.
Some years are better, but obviously it's a good idea to put up some labels, but I don't think people should worry if they can find a Rosé of Provence that they want to try it. It's not going to make a difference if it's one chateau or another.
Buy this one and nothing
because
else. Obviously,
apparently there isn't that much difference when you go from one house to the other. It's more the year and whether it's a really good AOC. And then, of course, the other thing that is not specifically directly just Aix-en-Provence, but which is associated with it because it's one of the things you can find a lot of on the market, is lavender. And lavender is one of the major products of the region around Aix. You can go and visit places, including a monastery that produces lavender, and see the lavender fields, and it's just one of the most beautiful, wonderful things to do. But it's one of the specialties that you will find in sachet or loose in bottles or whatever on the market in Aix. Basically, what happens, what we're talking about is a part of France, the southeast, that is filled with light. I decided I was going to do a baby brainstorming of my own, and I realized that the first two things I wrote down about Aix-en-Provence were light and stone, because when you walk away, when you leave Aix, I think that those are the two things you remember more than anything else, is the wonderful, wonderful, very strong, bright light of Provence, which you get in Aix, not just in Aix, but obviously everywhere, in Aix. And the beautiful stone, the limestone that is used for making most of the buildings. And it's quite amazing. I have a photographer friend who years ago came to visit me in the south of France, and he had a light meter with him. It's something, strangely enough, I've always remembered. And he said that when he went to Aix and the region right around it and opened the light meter, the needle went off the top. It went off the top of the chart. There's something about the light of Provence, and you get that in Aix. And I think it's one of the things that people just love when they go there. It's very, very, very special. So Aix is a beautiful, beautiful place to begin a trip. You can either just go to Aix itself. By train, you can go directly from Paris. There's a bullet train that takes you right to Aix-en-Provence now. You can get there, obviously, if you're staying on the coast. You can get there by car. You can get there by train. You can get there from Arles. You can get there from Marseille. If you want to fly, you would have to fly to Marseille and then take a train or rent a car and go up there. It's about a half-hour drive from Marseille. And from there, you can go out and visit many of the small villages, which we'll list because it's impossible to just mention them all immediately like that on the podcast. And of course, you can visit Marseille. You can go and visit Avignon, which is not that far away, and eventually visit some of the other sites that we've mentioned, like Arles, which of course are major cities and deserve their own little podcast.
Yeah.
But Aix is a great place to visit and a great place to start a trip exploring Provence.
Yeah, it's a good place to stay, I think, especially if you have a car, because then from Aix you're not very far from anything else, and you can just use it as a day trip kind of center. I think that's one of the ways you. It's one of the ways.
Provence. I mean, if you look at a map, you will see that Aix-en-Provence is basically in the eastern part of Provence as a region. So there are lots of things you can do as day trips, but you know that now I have a French mentality about this. So for me, a day trip means going to someplace that's 50, 60 kilometers away. I would not suggest staying in Aix to go and visit the area around Nice or the area around Antibes or even the area necessarily around Arles, because you want to take advantage of being in those places and see the little villages and towns right around it as well.
I'm just saying to go see the villages right around
it. They're absolutely wonderful.
Not 100 kilometers away.
No. And there are many. And of course, one of the regions that's extremely posh, and one of the areas that all these famous people that we don't want to name live in, is the area basically north of Aix, and that is an area called the Luberon.
Yeah.
And the Luberon is small mountains, and it's filled with very, very beautiful little villages, but those are actually places where you you can't even imagine the cost of staying there compared to even staying in a place like Aix. We stayed in a fine little hotel just for a couple of nights, and it was just lovely, you know. But this is really going to the region of the stars in a sense.
Yeah.
But we'll mention all of these villages nearby, and we're going to begin a whole series. We're not going to do it every single week, but I really know that we'll do a lot of things that start with that are in Provence and in the southeast, as well as going back to the southwest, so that we give you the flavor of Paris and the other parts of France as well.
Right, there's plenty to see in
There's
France.
so much to see.
And there's also a lot of wonderful food and wine and so forth. And so I'll put some links to those.
And recipes.
And and recipes. That's
Aioli.
true. Aioli. Oh, aioli.
Aioli.
Yes.
Aioli. Aioli, which is, of course, made with garlic and olive oil.
Mm-hmm.
And what? And with egg.
Well, it's like a mayo with oil.
It's a mayonnaise with garlic.
It's a garlic
and it's
mayonnaise.
used with fish.
Yes,
a
and
lot.
It's lovely.
And it's lovely.
Yeah, but just in this episode, we've mentioned a bunch of things: Santon, Calisson d'Aix, olive oil, the lavender packets, the aioli. I mean, there's so many things. So I'll put some links there. And you might have noticed if you go to the website that there's now a new tab. I mentioned it last week. It's a resource tab. And under there, I'll make a collection of all these lovely French things. So I've got books, movies, music, helpful links for, various things that I think are the most helpful things that you need to know. Food, gifts, I mean, that's that sort of thing. So just go to the website, look at those, and if you do that, you're also helping the show grow up and pay its own bills.
Yes. We've mentioned a bunch of books and a bunch of movies, and there will be more mentioned all the time.
Right.
And of course, talking about Provence, what we should do is mention the movies that are, of course, Manon des Sources,
of course.
Which is a wonderful, wonderful movie that's been made actually 3 different times. I think maybe even 4. The most famous one that, of course, I remember is the one with Yves Montand and Daniel Auteuil.
Oh, that's old.
It's 25 years old.
Yeah, okay.
Why, do you know a more recent one?
Maybe not.
There was one done that was, I think, in the 30s or 40s with, the old style black and white French actors where I understood nothing of what they said because they all had Provençal accents, At least with the one from the 1980s, you can understand everything that they're saying. Lots of books by a writer named Giono, who wrote about Provence.
Pagnol.
And Pagnol.
Of course.
Who wrote more about Marseille, though, I think.
Yes.
But
it's 25 kilometers away. I mean, it's not like 2 hours away.
Yeah. But if I remember correctly, he really writes about the working class people in Marseille. I'm not sure, but there are lots of other movies and some artists which are worth mentioning that are also from
I'm
there.
not going to recommend that you buy any Cézanne paintings because I don't know where you'd find those.
You can buy a print.
Yes, there are prints. Yes.
A print of Mont Saint-Victoire.
Yes. Those are very nice. Anyway, so when you go through these links, you're actually helping us make a little bit of money, and I do mean a very little bit of money. It's like pennies. If you buy a movie, we might get 4 cents. I mean, it's really not very much. But if enough people do that, at the end of the month, we might have enough to pay for the hosting fees or for the streaming fees for the podcast, for the actual audio file. So we would love it if you would go through our links, and it doesn't matter if we buy the stuff we recommend or anything else on Amazon. Once you've clicked through our link, for 24 hours, anything you buy on Amazon will get a small commission.
And it's and let us know if you discover a book or a movie or something through our recommendations and what you think of them. That would be interesting. I would love to know about
or
that.
even if there's some that we didn't recommend that you think we should look at. Because I'm only recommending things that I've watched or read or tried or tasted.
Or that I have.
Or that you have, yeah. Because we don't want to start making recommendations based on nothing. We want to do it based on something we've tried. So there you go. Thank you so much, Elise. We've learned a lot. And we will talk to you next week.
We'll talk to everybody next week.
Okay, au revoir.
Au revoir.